Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Welcome to Cut the Crop. FAR has had two CEOs since it was formed 25 years ago. The first was Nick Pyke and the second, current CEO, is Alison Stewart. I'm Anna Heslop, the Communications Manager at FAR, and today I have Alison and Nick with me to talk about how FAR and the New Zealand arable industry has developed since 1995. 2020 is FAR's 25th birthday. Alison, you've been at the helm for 2 years now. Why did you apply for that job, and what's your vision for the future of arable in New Zealand?
It seems like a lot more than 2 years. But clearly not 22 years, which is what Nick was. I've been a plant scientist all of my career, and I've had a lot of interactions with the arable sector over those years. And of course, I knew Nick from his pre-FAR days when you were in good old Hort Research. And I was very fortunate. I was asked to be on the external review panel of FAR back in 2016. And so that gave me a really good insight into what FAR was doing and what the challenges were for the industry and what, most importantly, what the opportunities were. And so I just, when Nick decided to retire, I looked at that job and I sort of thought I really would like to get back to I guess the real end of the research spectrum, having been in academia for such a long time. And I'd really enjoyed my interactions with the vegetable growers when I'd started my career. And so I thought it was a really nice way for me to end my career, is to be back working with the growers. And that was what really encouraged me. I guess I also saw that the whole plant-based industry and market opportunities were there, and I really liked the idea of being able to help the arable sector position itself as a highly profitable and I guess sustainable land use option in New Zealand. And so all of those things really attracted me to the job. And Nick, of course, told me it was a really good job. And I sort of thought, well, if Nick enjoyed it, then I would probably enjoy it too.
Okay, fair enough. Nick, as the founding CEO, you managed to hang in there for 23 years, and through 4 referenda. So tell us a little bit about why and how FAR was formed and how it's developed since then in the 1990s.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Yes, so FAR was formed basically through the foresight of a few farmers that recognised that if they were not engaged in investing in research, then government was going to reduce the investment in arable research in New Zealand. And those farmers recognised that if they could put a levy in place, they'd be able to invest in their future, and went through the process of getting the commodity levy in place. That was before I came on board, and then fortunately I was appointed to the role, although I'm not sure I thought it was fortunately in the first few weeks when I was sitting there in my motel room, which is my living space, my working space and my social space for the first 3 months, and was able to get things up and running to create an organisation which hopefully is moving forward and keep moving forward to support the farmers in New Zealand.
So what was that setting up all about? What did you actually have to do?
Yeah, so to put it bluntly, when I sat down the first day, I had a pencil and a piece of paper. And I did an aha moment and thought, what do I do next? So I realised that to operate a business, you probably needed a bank account, you probably needed a computer, you probably needed a motor vehicle, a telephone, and we had moved to the age of cell phones by then, so I had to get a cell phone.
Quite a big one.
Yeah, quite a big one, quite heavy. And eventually moved on to realise we needed an office, even though there was just me, and some support things around me. But integral to all of that was the support of the farmers and the fact that we had and still have these ARGs, arable research groups around the country, and within that a huge supportive group of farmers that were encouraging me and supporting me, and at times being quite critical and quite focused in their criticism of what I thought was simple and they thought was a lot more difficult, or the other way around. And as a result of that, we've put together, which I think is a great network and is still part of it, is that group of farmers across the country that feed into the system.
So what were their drivers? What were their key research priorities in the 90s?
Yeah, so back at that stage, we were quite a long way behind in yields what was happening elsewhere in the world, particularly in the cereals. And so there was a number of fairly significant shifts that needed to occur if we were going to catch up. Fortunately, we partnered with an organisation in the UK, Arable Research Centres, which were leading a lot of applied research for the cereal crops in the UK, and that saw a fairly significant and fairly rapid shift in New Zealand towards increased inputs towards cereals, a very significant shift from spring sown crops to winter sown crops, and along with that came a number of consultants from the UK that supported that change outside of FAR. So that meant we moved from yields which were well below what was occurring in Europe to yields that were challenging and now are probably better than what they were getting in Europe. So that was the first thing that was on the block. And I guess that phase lasted probably 6-8 years before it became obvious some other changes were going to be needed. And the environmental regulations were starting to appear, and things like water, nutrients and so on and so forth became part of the mix. So that created a lot of other challenges because we had established a network of farmers that were expecting to see increases in yield year on year from the research that was being done within FAR and by the research organisations we were using to do that. And that took a bit of working through.
So somewhere along the line you went from working in a motel room to on your own to having a staff of about 20 odd people in New Zealand. Not that odd, 20 or so people in New Zealand. How did that come about? What was the changes there?
So obviously there was a reasonably small levy take in the first year. It was just over $500,000, so there wasn't a heck of a lot we could be doing at that stage, so it didn't require more than one person and eventually one and a bit persons to do that. As the levy income increased, the amount we could invest in increased, and the requirement to have people to support that increased. And initially that was an office type support role because we were not engaged in any of the doing around either the research or the delivery of the outcomes. But over time, to me and to the board, it became, I'd say, obvious that the best way to deliver information to the farmers that we were working with was to have good knowledge of it. And the best way to have good knowledge of it was to have some involvement in the projects from when they started. And the level of engagement that FAR had in projects varied from doing the work entirely with the team that's at FAR through to pretty much hands-off, just developing a contract and working closely enough with the CRI or university to understand what was going on, so that when it came time to deliver the outcomes, the person standing up from FAR that was talking about it at least knew where they were at. And so that resulted in an increase in staffing, and we needed to develop a team that had knowledge of the range of crops and things like that.
So what were some key projects in that time?
Oh, there's a whole heap of key projects, and we haven't got all day, so I'll limit it a bit. So I think one of the key ones was nitrogen managers for environmental accountability, and that started quite a number of years ago now and has evolved into all of the range of nitrogen projects or nutrient-related projects that are going on now, because it was really a project that identified what the challenges were going to be for not just the arable industry, but the farming industries around nutrients. And it was a project that identified that overseer was likely to play a key role in what was going on in the future. And so from that, we invested in a review of overseer from an arable perspective, not across the board, which I think has been pretty fundamental in guiding some of the research up until when I left anyway, around what we did with nutrients. I think that at the time there was a lot of concern from some of our farmers on the ARGs that wasn't an area we should be working in because they just wanted to increase production. But it's proved to be a very logical move, I think, and that's something that was really critical to where we're going now, or where you're going now.
You're still part of the industry. Don't worry, we haven't eliminated you out of our family.
I got to be careful though, Alison, just in case there's a change in focus that I'm unaware of. So that was one. I think some of the others, the work on plant growth regulators and ryegrass, that was a yield-related one that's had a huge impact on the industry and really taken the industry forward. And that's just been incremental year on year, increasing the yields of ryegrass. And it was not only the PGRs, but it was how you worked with irrigation or nutrients to get the best sorts of yields. So they're two quite distinct projects. One other one that I think has had a very good outcome and has been announced in the media this week is how far worked in the biosecurity space, and the fact that we had very early engagement in the pea weevil outbreak. We were able to provide guidance and support to that, and I think to have right through the whole of the biosecurity process, and it's resulted in the eradication of the pest. Along with that, there was the ability to try and provide some supporting projects for the farmers in the Wairarapa, so they didn't feel hung out to dry, that there was things going on that hopefully provided some other crop options for them in the future. So that's a couple.
So a lot.
And there's a lot more as well as that, obviously, that we could probably talk all day about.
Yeah, so Alison, some of those are obviously carrying on now. There was no kind of, it wasn't like, out with the old, in with the new. Pea weevil has been a brilliant success. Nutrient management, obviously, still an issue. How much of what Nick was saying rings true for what you're hearing and seeing now?
Oh, absolutely. I think that FAR had a lot of foresight, sort of 5-10 years ago in identifying what the issues were going to be, not only for the arable sector, but for agriculture in New Zealand. And I think that the arable growers today have a lot to thank Nick in particular for, who really identified what some of those issues were, and we were able to get in and start some of that research. And it's not one of those quick fixes. You're not going to be able to just sort of say, 5 years down the track, that's that project finished and let's move on. The whole environmental compliance space, nutrient management, water use efficiency, even the use of pesticides, are being questioned from a social license point of view. And so arable growers, as are many of the other growers and farmers in New Zealand, are really having to rethink a lot of their management practices. They're having to rethink the use of synthetic inputs. And that's going to be a big challenge. We don't want to be too defensive by saying, we've got to be able to use them in the way that we want to use them, because we have to be responsive to the consumer. But it is a big challenge to be able to reduce synthetic inputs, be sustainable, have a good environmental footprint, and still be profitable. And you can't have a profitable farm sort of business if you don't take into account what the consumer wants. But equally so, the consumer does have to understand the reasons why farmers actually manage the farms in the way in which they manage. So it is a challenge. We're fortunate that we've started this journey, and we can see a light at the end of the tunnel, and we can see a pathway forward for our growers. It's a matter of being able to get the message out and to be able to take all of the research that FAR's done over nearly 25 years and be able to package it in a way that growers can adopt it on their farm in a way that will help them, I guess, find a path through the increasingly difficult legislative environment that we've got in New Zealand.
I think one of the really important things Alison said in that is that trend towards what the consumer is asking, and that was part of where we could see that FAR was going to need to move in the last few years I was there. And again, that creates some real challenges, is how do we make that transition to be more focused around producing things that the consumer wants as opposed to just increasing yields. And I shouldn't say just increasing yields, because that's a really important component of what needs to happen on farm if they're going to remain viable. But there's no point increasing yields if you're not producing something that the customer and the consumer wants. And I think that's really got to be part of where things are moving, not just in the arable industry, but in all of New Zealand's agricultural industries going forward.
And I think a key thing is understanding that the consumer makes judgments not necessarily based on scientific evidence. In many cases it's emotive, and that doesn't mean that it's not a valid judgment for them. And so we always think as scientists and researchers that as long as you bring information to the table, you can educate the consumer. But in many cases the consumer has decided what they want to be educated in and what they don't want to be educated in. And their philosophical and emotive viewpoints actually often drive their decision making. And we as a food producing industry have to understand that.
Yes.
So where do plant-based foods fit in there? Is that an opportunity for the arable industry?
Well, I think both Nick and I see it as an opportunity, but I think it's an opportunity that has to be carefully thought through. Yeah. And I think we both get quite frustrated by the hype that goes on about, plant-based food versus animal, and it's not as straightforward as perhaps people in the media and the general public think.
I think I'd agree entirely with that. I mean, I think what we've got to be looking at is where New Zealand has its point of difference, where we can, as a country and as farmers within that, in New Zealand, produce things that the consumer wants that are plant foods. And I personally don't see any reason why we would produce protein to make into a meat patty that's going to go into the lowest common food priced product to feed somebody who doesn't actually care about their food to start with. So we need to be looking at how can we create food that has unique attributes that are distinctly New Zealand, that have quality, have value, that are going to deliver value to New Zealand and to our farmers. And they will have some plant based foods, there'll be some that are animal based, and again that has to be integrated into what the customer, who's always right, the consumer, who's always right, wants.
And I think the key thing for New Zealand is not to take this sort of conflicting sort of viewpoint about things and pit the animal sectors against the plant sectors. And I get very frustrated when I hear, sort of those kinds of sort of threats and challenges being made, because New Zealand should be able to be top producers of both animal and plant produce, and we should be working together to work out how we can leverage benefits from the livestock sector into the plant sector and vice versa.
And I think over time that's been one of the real strengths of FAR, is that it recognises that arable is a relatively small component of New Zealand farming systems at the moment, but it's part of a farming system. So integrating animals and plants into a farm has really been a large part of what FAR has tried to achieve over many years. It recognised that you can't have a arable farming system that is truly sustainable for the long term unless you have animals as part of that system.
And so it would be really good to be able to promote that as the future vision for New Zealand, is getting the very best by integrating plants and animals, because from an environmental point of view, it's clearly, the best way to go for New Zealand.
Correct.
And from an economic point of view, if we can leverage and get secondary revenue streams sort of passing between the two different systems, then it should be a win-win. And FAR, because our growers in many cases have already been in that place and they know how to integrate it, I think that we can take a real leadership role in painting that picture of what New Zealand agriculture could look like.
Okay, so that's a little bit of looking forward. It's 2020, it's FAR's 25th birthday. When we hit 30, people look back and say, 25th, God, what happened that year? Is there anything kind of memorable happening for this 25th year?
I think every year is memorable for FARD. No, seriously, we're in a transition period because obviously, Nick was the CEO for 22 years. I've been in the job for 2 years. There's a lot of things happening in New Zealand at the moment. We don't want to throw out all of the good things that we've started and need to finish. We've got a lot of challenges internally within New Zealand that we need to deal with from an environmental footprint point of view. But we have to focus on the big opportunities. And, I think that developing really good relationships with other sectors in New Zealand is going to be a big push. And, we're doing a lot more collaborative research with the other plant-based sectors. And we're also sort of doing a lot more innovative thinking with the livestock sectors about how we can integrate our systems. But then we've also got to recognise that the rest of the world moves on and that New Zealand is just this little country, down in the southern hemisphere. And so we do have to keep connected with what the arable industry is doing overseas. And we've always had a really good relationship with the AHDB in the UK, but last year we actually formalised that, and we've now got, I think, a really fantastic opportunity to work collaboratively with a much bigger agency in the UK, much better funded, and it's going to allow us to be able to leverage our levy funds in a much more effective way. And I think the next big push for FAR is embracing a new way of knowledge exchange and communication. And we're sitting here doing a podcast. I mean, I'm not sure that we would have even thought about that 2 or 3 years ago. And so we do recognise that our growers are receiving information in a different way. We still have to provide sort of some of our growers, with the traditional communication methods. But I think we need to be embracing social media, new ways of communication. And as you know, Anna, we're just about to start a major knowledge exchange programme, trying to identify a new way of engaging with growers throughout the country. The Arable research groups that Nick established are a fantastic resource and a means by which FAR can connect with a very wide range of growers. We probably haven't optimised the way in which we can use our regional grower groups in order to be able to get more connection into the regions. And I think that's going to be the big focus for FAR over the next couple of years. And in 2030, I would love the growers to be able to say, I would love, rather than the 500 growers that we connect really well with, I would love 2,500 growers to be saying, yeah, FAR delivers benefit to the industry.
That was an interesting conversation because the way we deliver information to farmers has changed hugely over the 20 years that I was involved. And so very early in the piece, we put together a folder which had a number of, at that stage, arable updates in it. And we spent all day, 2 of us, and all weekend actually, 2 of us putting these folders together to send out to growers because that is how they said they wanted to receive information. Then we looked at how we could start to electronicise information and developed a CD. And so they all received a CD. I don't know how many of them have still got them. I've got one tucked away somewhere just as a bit of a memorabilia of time at FAR. But it's absolutely no use for anything because I don't know how to make it run. And then we moved on to starting to communicate with emails, and from that evolved some of the weekly sorts of emails that farmers are getting now, which are giving them just-in-time information about what's going on. And so I think that it's going to be constantly changing, and I think this is the next great move into how to get information to farmers in a form that they can use it. And with modern tractors and things like that, they can listen to a podcast while the tractor drives them up and down the paddock. So it gives them the opportunity to keep up to date with information in a really great and easy manner. And it's going to keep changing, and farmers are going to be recognising that and receiving information differently 10 years from now. Which won't be my worry. It might be Alison's, but it won't be mine.
I don't know about that. It might be somebody else's by then. No.
So, And it's going to be constantly changing, and that's one of the great things that I think FAR and the farmers behind FAR have constantly been saying, keep up with how you deliver information, but don't move ahead of it, because we could have gone electronic too quickly and left them all behind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, Nick and Alison. That's been a lot of fun. I'm sure there's a whole lot more good stories out there, but that might be for another day.
Well, there's a lot of good stories. They're probably not the sorts that we should talk about on a podcast. There's a few from conferences and
exactly be the ones to talk about on a podcast.
There's a few from conferences and things like that. Some of them might even involve you, Anna. So you might not want me to recite some of those.
Surely not. Okay, 25 years of FAR. Roll on the next 25.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.